Is everybody happy? Okay, I was just checking everybody's happy with us recording. Yeah,
Yep.
welcome everybody. I'm Andy Bates. As of Saturday, I'm now the London Housing Group policy officer. I also organise speakers, and I'm delighted to have Graham here tonight. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Graham in a minute. I just wanted to do a bit of project placement for our forthcoming events before everybody goes off and has their tea. So Wednesday, the 2nd of April, we've got Jay Morton talking about the housing dilemma, density, carbon, and the pathway forward. If anybody wants a sneak preview of Jay, she does her own podcast, Architects for Change. Wednesday, the 14th of April, we've got Ben Cooper, who's the research manager at the Fabian Society, talking about their new report, Home Comforts, Eradication of Poor Quality Rented Accommodation. And then at a slightly odd time, 10 o'clock on Sunday, the 4th of May, we've got Wendy Hayhurst and Jessie Taylor talking about putting community in community housing. And the reason it's an odd time is that they're based in Australia, and this is our way of working the time out. So with no further ado, I'll come back to Graham. I just need to make him a little bit bigger on my screen. Yeah, thank you. So Graham is a housing lawyer. He's been working with some of the families involved, some of the Grenfell families. He's been contributing to the Grenfell inquiry, and he'll talk to us about some of the main outcomes. So I don't think there's possibly a more important thing for us to be talking about. I tried to impress Graham by telling him he's going to go on Spotify, but apparently he's already on Spotify with his own band called Red Town. Although if you listen to them on Apple, apparently gets five times as much. Okay, so Graham, do you want to kick in with the main lessons learned from the inquiry?
Sure, thank you. And then thank you for the Red Town plug. It hadn't occurred to me that this would be a place to plug my band, but and anywhere's as good as anywhere else. So can I just briefly say how I sort of structured my talk or this discussion? I thought I'd just say a little bit about my own personal experiences of acting for the Grenfell families in the immediate aftermath of the fire. Then I think I've got quite a little bit to say about the inquiry. I mean, again, it's going to be headlines really, and because it's such a huge topic. I'm then going to say a little bit about the, to me, quite horrifying series of blatant warnings that were ignored, and then try and draw it all together with some lessons for the future. So I have slightly provocatively called the talk the Grenfell Atrocity. So why have I called it that? Well, look, quite simply, the avoidable deaths of 72 people and the loss of over 100 homes and everything in them, the traumatization of an entire community, were the result of essentially three things: corporate greed and a callous indifference to human life, a deliberate policy of deregulation described by David Cameron when it was brought in as a bonfire of the regulations, which, in the circumstances is rather sick, isn't it? And a complete failure to listen to tenants and to listen to leaseholders, a contempt and disregard for their direct, first-hand lived knowledge of issues affecting their own homes. The dictionary definition of an atrocity is an extremely cruel, violent, or shocking act. Many of the Grenfell families have used the term to describe what happened to them, and it seems to me to be entirely apt. So my involvement started really on the day of the fire. I used to practice in Notting Hill between 1985 and 2015, and then my practice merged with a larger one and moved to Putney, but we still had a strong connection in Notting Hill and many clients from the area. And as one of the few specialist housing teams in the area, we and other housing solicitors immediately felt that we had to do something. And we teamed up with Shelter and North Kensington Law Centre in the immediate aftermath of the fire to provide the free housing advice that was obviously going to be needed. Now, I recall the fire was on a Wednesday. There was a lot of frantic activity over the next couple of days and over that weekend. And our first advice session we ran the following morning in the gym at the Westway Sports Centre. For the first few days after the fire, and this is really quite shocking, but it is the case, as Kensington and Chelsea Council slowly, far too slowly, got to grips with what they needed to do, dozens of people made homeless by the fire were sleeping in the Westway Sports Complex. Within 2 days of the fire, fortunately, the Gold Command system had been activated, so several other London boroughs provided expertise and practical help as the response by Ken Chelsea was so inadequate. So after a few days, a week or so of advising in the sports hall, our advice sessions moved to the law centre. Now, purely coincidentally, this is right at the foot of Grenfell Tower. It's actually physically attached to Grenfell Tower. And we as housing lawyers started acting more formally for different families and individuals who needed rehousing. And then in due course, we were instructed in respect of the public inquiry and the compensation claims. So before I talk a bit about some of the things that came out of the inquiry and what I think are some lessons for the Labour government, just one or two reflections from those early days. Many of those who died had not been identified, and so as one walked around North Kensington, on every fence and every lamp post, one could see posters seeking information with photos of the missing. These were really quite unbearably poignant and have stuck in my mind's eye ever since. At that time, there were fears the tower might collapse, and as I've mentioned, the law centre was actually attached to the base of the tower. And on one occasion, a couple of weeks after the fire, I was in the office there, the alarm sounded, and the sensors on the tower had detected too much movement. We all had to evacuate, and the advice session continued in one of the local churches. Now, I mean, that's something that you may all remember, that the churches and the local mosque have provided a vital sanctuary and help on the night of the fire and in the immediate aftermath. So as housing lawyers, we fought a number of battles over getting our clients rehoused, but it was quite unusual in one sense because not a single case went to court. There was a lot of quite hard negotiation, but basically the council, I think, were acutely aware of the adverse public reaction that they would have suffered if they were seen to be taking a hard line with people who had lost everything in such terrible circumstances. So after several months, we moved from mainly concentrating on getting our clients properly rehoused to the inquiry itself. And I'm sure most, if not all of you, will have followed the inquiry or will know what came out of it. And so all I think I can do here is just provide some of what to me seem to be the selected highlights, or in certain cases, as you'll hear, they're really lowlights. And the Grenfell story is a complicated web of entanglement. But if you strip a lot of that away, everything starts with the manufacturers, the three manufacturers, Celotex, who are now Saint-Gobain, Kingspan and Arconic. And they made flammable materials, insulation and cladding for use in construction projects. They knew that what they were making was dangerous. They made it anyway. That is the simple starting point of this horrific series of events. Celotex and Kingspan, who made the insulation, deliberately cheated the safety tests at the building research establishment. In one case, and these are simply examples. But in one case, they attached materials to a non-flammable rig, so it didn't catch fire in the same way as it would have done, uh, uh, had the materials been normally in situ. And so that gave an entirely false result. Another example is that an insulation product was tested, passed the test, and quite simply, the company, which was Kingspan, put on the market uh, a, a different product to the one that had been used, a different specification, and nobody noticed. Now, Arconic, who made the cladding, knew that the cladding, ACM, aluminium composite material, was dangerous, and they knew it didn't meet European safety standards, especially in its cassette form, which was how it was attached to Grenfell Tower. Now, this was tested in its cassette form, and its fire performance was described as devastating. It burnt so fast and let off so much heat that the test was halted after 14 minutes, and no certificate of any sort was given. But nonetheless, it made its way onto the market. Now, how dangerous was ACM? As you know, there are a number of experts who advised the inquiry, but we, on behalf of the families, also instructed our own experts, basically to help us navigate the complex expert evidence. And one of the experts we instructed was a fire engineer whose name is Guillermo Rein, who is a professor at Imperial College. And he gave to me what struck me as being a very, very graphic description. He said, it's as if you drove 4 full petrol tankers containing tens of thousands of litres of petrol and encased the building in the content of those petrol tankers. Now, I mean, let that sink in. That is it is horrific, and it is extraordinary that that product was allowed onto the market. But what Arconic did was they took advantage of the weak regulatory regime in several countries. And surprise, surprise, one of the countries with such a weak regulatory regime was the UK. And in particular, they persuaded the British Board of Agreement, which is another of the regulatory bodies, to issue a certificate that didn't distinguish between the two forms of fixing. And this may seem like a minor thing, but in fact, apparently, when fixed to a building in its riveted form, the edges aren't exposed, and the material is regarded, or certainly was regarded then, as much less dangerous. But the cheaper way of fixing was to fix it in what's called a cassette form, and that was how the cladding was fixed to Grenfell Tower. And what Arconic did was they persuaded the BBA that they shouldn't distinguish between the two methods of fixing. So they knew exactly what they were doing. They were out to maximize their profit. And one of the bits of evidence that came out at the inquiry was an internal email from 2011. And this referred to them being unable to sell ACM in cassette form in Spain. And it quoted a Spanish customer as saying that ACM in cassette form was close to spontaneous combustion. But nonetheless, they were at pains to hide this from the UK regulators, so they could continue to sell it in both its cassette and in its riveted forms. In 2007, one of their executors had even speculated, and this is another piece of evidence that came out of the inquiry. So this is an email in which he said, "What will happen if a building made of polyethylene core is on fire and kills 60 or 70 people? What is the responsibility of the ACM supplier?" He suggested that they switch to fire retardant cladding, but they didn't. And as I've said before, they knew exactly what they were doing. So faced with such cynical and unscrupulous tactics, the regulators should have prevented the products from reaching the market in the first place. But as I've indicated above, the three companies pulled the wool over the regulators' eyes. And there's a crucial reason that they were able to do this. Both the BBA and the BRE were privatized. They were funded by the fees paid by the companies seeking certificates so they could sell their products. So that thus created what to me is a completely irreconcilable conflict of interest. They were funded by those who they should have been policing, and so those who they should have been regulating were their clients. This is actually best summed up in a quote from the inquiry's mostly very hard-hitting report. So the chairman of the inquiry said, the underlying problem was that the BBA failed to manage the conflict between the need to act as a commercial organisation in order to attract and retain customers, and the need to exercise a high degree of rigour and independence in its investigations in order to satisfy those who might consider relying on its certificates. So at best, the regulators were not nearly rigorous enough, and at worst, in at least one case, they actually advised the company whose product was being tested, in other words, their client, how to best get the product through the test. I'll look at the government's response to the inquiry recommendations at the end of this discussion. And one of these regulations, one of the most important ones, is that there should be a single regulator. A crucial issue is how that will work and how it will be funded. So looking at some of the other main actors in the Grenfell refurbishment, Studio E, who are the architects, Ryden, the contractors, Harley Curtain Wall, the cladding subcontractors, the inquiry found a litany of failings in expertise and incompetence. And this meant, for example, individuals and organisations working on the refurb who lacked basic knowledge of refurbishing a high-rise block. Incidentally, Ryden had manipulated the procurement process in the first place in order to get the contract. That's just one of the many kind of side strands of the whole inquiry. And they were found by the inquiry to have shown a very casual attitude to fire safety throughout. Most shockingly, there was a company called Exova, and their job was to advise on fire safety. They produced a draft report. It was never finalised, and no one at any stage in the whole process picked up that that report had not been finished. And absolutely central to this story of deceit and incompetence was the decision by KCTMO, the tenant management organisation, the arm's length body that was managing the refurbishment and managing the tower, the decision by them and by Ryden to save £239,000 by changing the original specification from zinc, non-flammable zinc, to ACM in cassette form. Now we know there was pressure on the TMO from the council to save money, and there's a wealth of evidence and discussion about how the cost could be brought down using this now notorious term, value engineering. But if that one cost-saving decision had not been taken, there would have been no fire. So I think from what I said, you can see that the manufacturers were, in the words of the inquiry report, systematically dishonest. The BRE and the BBA failed to regulate the products, and these products should never have gone on the market in the first place. And those working on the refurbishment lacked the experience and knowledge to see what dangers they were actually creating. And in particular, they lacked the knowledge to realize that ACM cassettes put in to save money, and I make no apology for repeating that point, were much more dangerous than the zinc alternative. But all of this potentially could have been nipped in the bud if the council's building control department had done its job properly. Might the council's officers have acted as a last line of defence Well, to understand this better, you have to go back 3 or 4 years before the fire. In 2013, RBKC Building Control had been restructured with, surprise, surprise, substantial staff reductions. The surveyor responsible for the refurb was, in the words of the inquiry report, overworked, inadequately trained, and had a very limited understanding of the risks of ACM panels. When he gave evidence at the inquiry, he said that he was working on between 120 and 130 projects at the time of his supervision of the refurbishment of the Grenfell Tower. Now, obviously, most of those other projects wouldn't have been of the same scale. That would have been physically impossible. But if you just consider the size and the complexity of the Grenfell project, refurbishing a 23-story building, a multi-million-pound project, this gives an idea of how stretched the building control staff must have been. So the surveyor lacked experience of this kind of project, but perhaps if he hadn't been so overstretched, perhaps if he hadn't been so overworked, he'd have devoted much more time to the detail of the project, and maybe could have had more training in areas he was unfamiliar with. But none of that happened. So one thing which, when I started to look at and understand better the history of high-rise fires and cladding fires in particular, is that far from being the first, Grenfell was just one in a series of fires with similar features going back over decades. Now, I can't talk about all of these, or we'd be here half the evening, but I'm just going to highlight a few. So in June 1999, 18 years before Grenfell, there was a fire in Garnock Court in Irvine in Scotland. This block had been clad for decorative reasons, one of the reasons for putting the cladding on Grenfell. Fire broke out on the 5th floor. It broke through a window and climbed the tower on the outside, spread by plastic cladding. So does that sound familiar? The fire, in which one person died, was the subject of a select committee investigation, and the report of the committee concluded, and this is a direct quote, "We do not believe that it should take a serious fire in which many people are killed before all reasonable steps are taken in minimizing the risks." The report also said that the danger of cladding systems was that the fire might exit a building at one floor, spread up the building, and re-enter through another floor. So that's exactly what happened at Grenfell. And this was 18 years before Grenfell. And the report really reads like a prediction. And then jumping forward 10 years, July 2009 was the Lacanal House fire in Southwark, in which 6 people died. The fire spread through a combination of inadequate fire doors, false ceilings, put in as part of a different refurbishment, and again, flammable cladding. Now, the coroner made a number of recommendations which went to the then Communities Secretary, Eric Pickles. Those of you who've, we all have to shake our heads in horror and disgust, because you probably know what I'm going to say next, which was that when he pitched up at the inquiry, he had the temerity to lecture the inquiry chair that he, Pickles, was a very busy man and that the inquiry should use its time wisely because, he was very important and he had lots of other things to do. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, that's not a direct quote, but that was the impression he created on the inquiry. And in fact, he came in for some very, very, very harsh criticism in the inquiry report. I'm a bit disappointed now that I haven't looked up the precise quote, but I'm afraid I haven't, but it's worth looking up. So anyway, he was Secretary of State at the time, and the coroner's recommendation went to him. And that recommendation included retrofitting sprinklers in all tower blocks, reviewing the stay put policy, another feature of Grenfell that I haven't mentioned, and that all cladding should be fireproof. Well, none of those recommendations was implemented. The whole thing was simply mothballed. So those are only two of the many fires in the UK which resulted in warnings and recommendations directly relevant to what happened at Grenfell being sent to government. Repeatedly, the dangers of flammable cladding have been highlighted. But despite this, the cladding manufacturers continued as before, and the regulators failed to adequately regulate. So Garnet Court and Lakanel were two very, very clear warnings, with detailed recommendations made by a select committee and a coroner. But as I said, they were far from the only ones. And some of you may remember this, but if we go back now over 50 years, there was a fire in the Isle of Man at the Summerlands holiday resort. This was a terrible fire in which 50 people died. And it was caused by, it wasn't cladding, but it was plastic covering on a leisure centre. And the inquiry which followed recommended sprinklers in all large buildings and that all external walls should be fire resistant. So that predates Grenfell by something like 45 years. Another one, 1991, Knowsley Heights in Liverpool. Again, a cladding fire. And then if we go abroad, from the beginning of the 21st century, there have been two, or I think it's now three, cladding fires in Dubai in high-rise buildings. The La Crosse fire in Australia, another fire in Singapore, also a horrific fire in Shanghai in China, which I think in which many hundreds of people died, and which I think the Chinese government tried to keep under wraps. But I mean, there is a long, long list of these sort of fires. So we have to ask, why? Why does it happen that all these warnings are given and nothing is done? So I'm not going to answer that question quite yet, and I'm not sure that there is a full answer, but we'll come back to that at the end of this discussion. So I think the other bit of the heading of the discussion was the lessons to be learned, and I want to turn to that now. And since I originally planned this talk, the government has published its response to the inquiry's recommendations. So I think it makes sense to look at the lessons to be learned in the context of what the government has taken on board and the changes that are proposed. Now, there are 58 inquiry recommendations. All but 9 of those have been accepted by the government, excuse me, and the other 9 have been accepted in principle. So that at least is very positive. Probably the most important recommendation is the creation of a single construction regulator, because I haven't really talked about this in any detail, but the whole system of regulation hitherto has been very, very fragmented. But the new body is not going to take on the testing and the certification of construction products, as the report recommended. So if we think back to what I was saying about 10 minutes ago, the BBA and the BRE passing products, they are going to, when they shouldn't have done, they are going to remain more or less as they are, albeit that they will be now subject to better regulation, I think, themselves. But given, there is very, very sharp criticism of both organizations in the report. And it seems to me that that is a lesson that really has not been learned. And the justification for not bringing everything under the umbrella of one regulator is that there would be a conflict of interest. If the same body is responsible for regulating testing and carrying out the tests, then the government's response is, well, that creates a conflict. But that is a far, far smaller conflict, and it is certainly one which can be got round, than the conflict which is created by the company seeking the regulatory certificate also being the one that funds the regulator. So I think that is an opportunity very much missed. And it's an aspect of the government's response to the report that the Grenfell family is very unhappy with. But the new regulator, I mean, I don't want to be too negative, because there is the potential for the regulator to be a very good thing, provided properly independently funded, and given teeth. And as with everything in government and the law, the devil will be in the detail. But leaving the Building Research Establishment and the British Board of Agreement in place, even if better regulated, is I think very disappointing. So I've talked quite a bit about the construction products because, as I say, the whole thing starts with the products. If flammable products hadn't been made in the first place, despite all the other multiple failings, we wouldn't be where we are today, and 72 people wouldn't have died. So, as part of its response to the inquiry, the government has also published a green paper on construction products. But disappointingly, there's now going to be a further consultation on this. Now, we've already had a 7-year inquiry that has laid bare, excuse me, laid bare construction practices in great detail. There's also been the report by Dame Judith Hackett in 2018, which further went into issues of fire safety. And then there is a separate government report from 2023 on construction products. But no, we have to have another consultation. Now, the timescale isn't that long, but nonetheless, it seems to me that the signal that it sends out is a lack of urgency, given the really, really pressing need to put things in place to ensure full and thorough regulation of the industry. Now, there are other good proposals which have been accepted. Proper qualifications for fire engineers, because bizarrely there is no separate fire engineering qualification. Proper training for fire risk assessors, licensing contractors working on high-rise buildings, because some of the contractors working on Grenfell had never done high-rise before. For the fire brigade, a college of fire and rescue, among many other recommendations directed at the fire brigade. The LFB is not my area of expertise, but generally the recommendations directed at the fire brigade seem to be very welcome ones, provided they're implemented. Building control. This is another very important recommendation. And the recommendation by the inquiry is for a panel to look at whether there should be a single national building control authority, and whether, because building control is partly privatized, it is in the public interest for all its functions to be carried out without any involvement from those with a commercial interest in the outcome, because building control is, in most local authorities, works in a sort of two-track way, and there is the building control department, the building control officers, who regulated or were meant to regulate Grenfell were in fact direct council employees, but there is a parallel, essentially privatized system that runs in tandem with it, and that again, it's the same point as the commercial organization paying the regulator to regulate its products. It's just an obvious conflict of interest, and it shouldn't happen. So will we move to a system preferably a national one that's properly funded, where inspectors don't have a commercial interest in acquiring and retaining customers. So, and obviously, I hope so, and I suspect everyone on this call has a similar view. But we're in a climate where there is still far too much faith and reliance put on the private sector to carry out tasks which, in my view, should be carried out by the public sector. So while we're on the subject of regulations and regulation, something which is obviously very topical is our government's drive to build new homes, 300,000 new homes a year. And then putting aside the other interesting question as to how many of these homes will be social housing, how many will be genuinely affordable, another great interest of mine, but that's not what we're discussing tonight. But that, this is a huge number of projects, and it's a massive undertaking. And it's absolutely vital that in the rush to build, that sight is not lost of the imperative for fire safety. And I am concerned that that could happen. One of the reasons the numerous warnings from other fires were ignored was undoubtedly simple inertia. Government agencies noted that things needed to be addressed, but simply didn't prioritize them. So that is one lesson. But another risk is not inertia, but just we've got to push ahead with all these new houses and all these new dwellings and simply not putting in place the mechanisms and ensuring that those mechanisms are properly regulated to ensure that the housing that is built is safe. Now, there are numerous other recommendations, but there's one other one which I think is hugely important, and it's not a direct recommendation about fire safety. It's this. It's of a legal requirement to maintain a publicly accessible record of recommendations made by select committees, by coroners, and by public inquiries. And not simply a requirement to keep a record, but to maintain a description of all the steps taken by government and a record of reasons if any recommendations are not implemented, and a requirement to report to Parliament annually on all these things. So I looked earlier at the warnings from these other fires, the recommendations by select committee, the recommendations by the coroner. And I'm not really familiar with the inner workings of government. It may well be that some of you are, but I mean, what seems to happen is the recommendations, reach a certain point, and then quite often, at best they're partially implemented, and at worst they're simply shelved. So, if this particular recommendation, which is essentially make sure that recommendations are monitored and implemented, if that is actually put into effect, that could go a long way to ensuring that things are not actually not simply talked about, but actually done. So it remains to be seen. This is one which has been accepted by the government in principle, but it needs to be accepted in its entirety, in my view. So there were also a number of things which our clients wanted to be included in the inquiry recommendations, which weren't, despite our best efforts to persuade the inquiry to include them. There's a long list. I'm only going to highlight about 3. One was to retrofit sprinklers in all high-rise blocks. Clearly expensive, but if it saves lives, then an expense worth spending. And if we think back to the Lacanau recommendations, this was actually one of the recommendations of the Lacanau coroner. Automatic sprinklers aren't going to prevent a conflagration, but they will certainly slow it down. And they are in common use in many, many parts of the world, but not so much in the UK. That's not going to be implemented. Another one we tried to press strongly for, which is in every high-rise block, a proper integrated fire alarm system linked to every single flat. That's simply, again, not a requirement. And another one, certainly extremely hard to implement once a block has been built, but relevant to future blocks, a requirement for a second staircase in every high-rise block. Again, not recommended, not to be implemented. But so it's a mixed bag, but there are nonetheless many things that should change for the better, and that is thanks to the relentless determination of the Grenfell families. And I mean, it may sound a bit trite, but it has been a genuine privilege to act for them. They are a group of incredibly motivated, dignified people who have been through terrible, terrible things, and they are fighting to improve things for all tenants in high-rise blocks, not in high-rise blocks, and indeed not only for tenants, for all occupants of high-rise blocks, because the cladding scandal, as we know, goes far, far beyond just the social housing rented sector. So social housing, I suspect several of you are professionals in the social housing sector. And as in our submissions to the inquiry, we proposed a number of recommendations, a lot of these which were focused on involving tenants and leaseholders in decisions directly affecting them, listening to their concerns, and addressing the whole culture of how social housing tenants are treated and viewed. Unfortunately, the inquiry's answer to this was to make no recommendations at all because of the additional powers that have been given to the regulator of social housing. So that seems to me, again, to be an opportunity missed. And the government report to the government response to the report quite rightly identifies the following, and this is a quote from the government's response to the recommendations. We must continue to go further to tackle where there are fragmented systems, barriers to access for vulnerable groups, and inconsistent feedback and follow-up. And that, that's a very, very laudable statement, and I'm sure we all agree. But there are no firm, concrete proposals to actually properly address these issues. So, I've in my notes, I've now scribbled a note that says conclusion. So the fire and its causes and the lessons to be learnt, I mean, it's a huge subject. A 7-year inquiry, over 400 days of evidence, a 1,700-page final report, not to mention we had to sift through 250,000 documents running to some several million pages. So obviously I've only been able to talk about some selected parts. And it's also the case that no one lawyer working on this inquiry really knows the whole picture because it is so vast, complex and labyrinthine. And I haven't, for example, going away from the inquiry, talked about the hundreds of thousands of people living in blocks blighted by cladding. And I haven't also mentioned the Building Safety Act 2022, which also went to address some of the issues. But I hope I have highlighted some important issues and examples, and particularly the the history of how all the warnings and the recommendations get ignored, and how important it is that we stop that, and that when disasters, tragedies, or indeed atrocities happen, that lessons are learned, and the changes are actually implemented. So the key thing, certainly in the construction industry, and in the housing sector generally, I think, and perhaps and in other sectors too, is regulation. And there is a danger of regulation being seen as a pejorative term. And it's often said the first duty of government is to protect its citizens, and that is usually seen in the context of the defense of the realm and the army, and there is truth in that. It is also the first duty of the state at both national and local level to protect people's safety, their safety and their security. And that, quite simply, is something which I think should be government's highest priority, along with the security of the realm. And if that means more regulation, if that means effective regulation, then so be it. And we have to learn the lessons of what took place in Grenfell in June 2017. So that is, I've gone on for a bit longer than I anticipated. Apologies for that. But
Okay, I'll let you run, Graham, because it was such a great systematic explanation. So I knew kind of snippets of this, but I think what you did is you brought all this together really systematically. I wanted to ask you. So there was no kind of big recommendation about money. So there's the building safety regulator. The word on the ground is that they're having real problems kind of staffing up um, at, at, at the moment. So the kind of inspections of the blocks over 18 meters are moving really slowly. Lots of planning approvals are being held up at the moment. Councils have got, particularly councils have got no extra cash to deal with this. So lots of really good recommendations, but not the money around. Was this kind of something that was discussed with the inquiry team?
the short answer is no, because the inquiry would. Uh, Lord Justice Morbick, the chairman of the inquiry, retired Court of Appeal judge, a real kind of stickler for the correct procedure. We did have some discussions very early on in the inquiry about the funding of recommendations. We didn't put them in our formal submissions, but it was kind of discussed behind the scenes, as it were. He was very clear that wasn't part of his remit. His job was to make recommendations to government. It is entirely up to government what it does with those recommendations. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. The recommendations have been made. They have financial consequences. They're going to cost money. It's up, it is up to government at national level to provide that money, and to ensure that it's provided to local government as well.
Yeah. We're a small informal group, so participants, please jump in with your questions.
Can I just go back down memory lane a bit? I took over as chairman of Housing in Gateshead in 1984. One of my first decisions was about cladding. We had 4 tower blocks in Harlow Green and they needed recladding. We even visited Glasgow to have a look at their cladding and came back and said, well, one thing we're not doing, we're not having anything like that. So, but the thing that is relevant is that I recall that somebody asked and somebody answered to the effect that, is this cladding flammable? And was assured that it wasn't. And I believe after Grenfell, all our cladding blocks, and some of them don't have cladding, were inspected, and that was found to be the case. So, I mean, I was absolutely staggered about the Grenfell Tower disaster, that it could have happened, and that there could have been flammable cladding on tower blocks in 2017, all that time later. And I went down and had a look, and just to horrify myself a little bit more. I just think it's everything you said is absolutely wonderful, and I'm glad to hear it. And it really must not happen again. And money must be found to to remove the flammable cladding that still exists. Again, I mean, it just illustrates really, how bad the government system is in this country in some respects. And my view of Mr. Pickles, or Lord Pickles as he now is unprintable. And that's from long experience.
Well, if you Google the inquiry's comment about him, I'm sure it'll come up. I don't think I've got time to find it now, but it's worth looking up. And I mean, like you, when this happened, I was just floored by the fact that this building, and we now know thousands of others, are encased in flammable cladding, because I presume the ones in Gateshead are zinc or similar. It's available.
Yeah.
It has similar insulation properties to the ACM. ACM is meant to be a good insulator. But of course, the big difference is the ACM is a lot cheaper than the zinc. So, extremely well done to Gateshead for putting under the safe cladding. And I'm sure there are many, many other local
Many others,
councils
yes.
around the country that have done the same. Not every council is having to have the cladding stripped off its high rise, but a fair number are.
Sorry, next question, please. I didn't realise I was on mute. So, Peter, come in. Okay, there's a question.
I think
in the
Craig was putting up
chat
his
from-
hand.
Yes, can you hear me?
Oh, right. Okay,
Yep.
okay. Let's go to Craig, and then I'll come back to Peter's question. Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Yeah, Craig.
Can I ask Graham, have any of the residents and the families thought about taking action on corporate manslaughter?
Right. Firstly, I don't think there is a Grenfell family that exists that does not want corporate manslaughter and indeed gross negligence manslaughter charges to be brought. Unfortunately, it's not our decision. It's not their decision. It is entirely a decision for the police and the CPS. Now, the line they have taken, which is a very cautious one, but it has a logic to it, is they were not going to launch any prosecutions until the inquiry had finished, because the various corporates involved will have teams of lawyers looking for every technical defense they can find, and one potentially would be essentially if the police followed a line of attack that was at odds with with the inquiry's report. So they decided quite early on that they weren't going to launch prosecutions until the inquiry had reported. What we didn't know at the time, but we now know, is that they're not starting from scratch now, because they have been, they've been following the inquiry and in filtering, going through all the evidence, but they haven't got nearly as far as we thought they would have done. Because what I rather anticipated and hoped was that they would have their charges and their files for the CPS prepared in draft, and then wait for the inquiry report. You would then cross-reference your draft with the inquiry report, and that might take months, but it shouldn't take years. What we're now told is that the earliest the file will go to the CPS is probably the end of this year or the beginning of next, and then it's going to probably take the CPS about another 6 months to make charging decisions. So
Okay.
the reality is criminal prosecutions
Yeah.
probably not to be started until 2027. And I said it wasn't up to the Grenfell families. I mean, it isn't. They do have a small role in the criminal justice system as victims, so we can make representations, and we do that quite frequently. But the ultimate decision is completely out of their hands.
Yeah, because I'm an architect and town planner, and I've been a regulator of building control.
Mm-hmm.
And our whole professional ethos was about safety in building control. And of course, it was privatized in England. And then BRE were privatized. BRE are decent people, but they were privatized, and they've gone down a commercial route. And I know a lot of them personally. I knew the head, he's moved on now. But there is a corporate responsibility there, to a duty to those people. These materials would not have been used if they hadn't had BBA certificates. But then Eric Pickles being told, I met the person, I won't name him, but immediately after Grenfell, I actually went to Grenfell, and I met the who used to be very high up in the London Fire Authority. I met him one night, and he told me what had happened. He told me that Lacknell House had been put right in front of Eric Pickles, and Eric Pickles had just parked it. And it just, everybody knows he parked it. If he hadn't parked it, the fire stopping and all the issues that Grenfell showed and led to such a tragedy would never have happened. It wouldn't have happened because it would have had to have been acted upon because it was so serious. But he parked it.
Yeah.
Anyway, that apart, we need to move on, and there needs to be, if anything, a media interest in this to help the people for the next 12 to 18 months to make sure the police get on with it. And Eric Pickles needs to be named and shamed for definite. He can't keep on passing the buck that it's about people advised him and what have you. Anyway, there might be an element of that, but BRE needs to be the socks pulled up. So the whole board structure and all of that, they need to make sure that they've got really high principles there, really high principles. Otherwise, these sort of things will happen again. There are 2,000 buildings with umpteen number of people in them, 250,000 people. I've got a friend who's just had to sell her flat in London and take £100,000 less for it just to sell it. There's tragedies all over the place here. Obviously, the people who've lost their families. But as you can tell, I feel quite passionate about it. And if anything, if there's anything that needs to be done, and with the experience I've got and the insight I've got from the discussions I've had, I'd be more than happy to help make sure that there is a continuation here. I used to chair the Crime and Disorder Reduction Partnerships, so I've had a very broad experience across 5 local authorities. I've been involved in mass retrofit of buildings. I know within 40 minutes of the start of the Grenfell fire, I could find the engineer's drawings and I could see exactly what was happening. It was flashing up the back there was no fire stopping. And it was using the plastic outer coating was just falling off the building. It was a floor a minute and people being incinerated. And then, of course, what you find that the tragedy of the fire brigade, who inspected the building, did make sure that the ventilation of the staircase getting the smoke out the staircase. They hadn't checked on that. There were multiple failings here. Not just a tragic, but they could happen again. And it's kind of like we take 7 years to do this. So you can see what governments do, in parking the issue, and I understand, why they haven't taken because it prejudiced the case and whatever. But 7 years,
Yeah.
it's crazy. Anyway,
Craig, that's a really strong statement. Do you want to respond to that, Graham?
I mean, what you were saying, Craig, about being happy to help. I mean, I can, if you wish, put you in touch with EOCS and our cladding scandal, who are the campaigning body for for all those affected by the cladding. Or you could also, I mean, I could also put you in touch with Grenfell United, who are the the main organisation for the families. But I think so if you want to do that, we can liaise afterwards.
okay, so
But yes, it is a question of trying to keep this in the public eye. This is only an impression, and I may be wrong, but I had a number of discussions with a person called Chief Superintendent Matt Bonner, who was in charge of Operation Northley, which is the police investigation. And he was the one who took the initial cautious decision. And he actually took a lot of flack from the families. But the way he put it was he would rather have the flack now, but have a successful prosecution, than in a few years' time seeing the directors of the companies on the steps of the Old Bailey celebrating their acquittal. And so for what it's worth, I think the police are genuinely invested in successful prosecutions. But my God, it's slow.
Yeah.
Graham, there's a couple of comments in the chat. I don't know if you're able to see them, or shall I read them?
Oh, hang on. Well,
So
I can get them. I just haven't. Chat. Here we go. Chat.
Yeah. So one from Peter and one from Ali.
Right. Sorry.
Shall I do with Peter's first?
Yes, go on.
So first one, as an architect, development director, delivering affordable housing and resident of council housing, my council and managing agents still don't listen to residents who know their homes the best. I'm surprised to hear that we still have problems. The construction industry 30 years ago had little regard for safety and relied on suppliers to provide advice on materials.
Yes. Well, I mean, the problem with, sorry, I'm just trying to get something up on my other screen. This is a basic problem, isn't it? That the tenants and those who live in the dwellings are often the last people to be listened to. If these recommendations are put into effect, and if they're properly monitored, then that is going to go quite a way. It's not going to solve the problem, but it's going to be quite a big step in the right direction.
So Ali comments so many facets to this. Shocked at the lack of follow through on the recommendations. So too early, or you're equally shocked, Graham?
Well, but presumably that's the recommendation. That's
the early recommendations.
I'm guessing that's all the recommendations from the other fires. Give the lads a chance. The recommendations were only made a few months ago. The government's response is mainly saying the right things, although with the various bits and pieces that we're not so happy with. the proof of the pudding will be in actually how it is put into effect. We are actually next. Oh, I think it's next week. We've been given a 30-minute audience with Matthew Pennycook
Brilliant.
to just to talk about the social housing
Yeah.
side of things, and we have a shopping list of I won't call them demands, but of
Yeah.
suggestions, all of which relate around a legally enforceable setup whereby tenants and leaseholders' voices have to be heard, basically.
Yeah.
So we'll see what comes of that.
Which would be brilliant. So yeah, we're all wishing you all the luck in the world with that, Graham. So just before we close, Paul, David, Asma, any kind of questions for Graham, Danny, Sophia?
Can I come in quickly and if it's all right?
Yeah, please, Asma. Yeah.
Can I just quickly say that, Graham, thank you for all the work that you're doing, representing the residents, and all the work that you carry on doing on, I know what can be such a long, tedious thing to carry on, pursuing. And there's so much learning, like you said, and there's so many things that we've already seen change. I know there's lots of conversations in the chat about TMOs and residents' voices. Still, in some of the recommendations, you don't quite hear loud enough about how much importance should be given to residents and their voices, and how that, when you look at it from the perspective of local government in particular, the governance doesn't really put them at the heart of all the work that we do. I know there's still going to be lots more recommendations coming, hopefully, and some findings, especially when the persecutions come to light. But we are in a place where we can't stop building, especially in London, because of the great need. I'm a councillor here in Tower Hamlets, and we're moving into a faster pace, and more concentration on taller buildings. And as we do that, and as I see the need, I still worry about what more could come out from the Grenfell inquiry that might be important for us to know now. Do you have any comments on that?
I don't think anything more is going to come out of the inquiry. So I think it's more a question of what has now been recommended. It's a question of that actually being put into effect. So I'd suggest, in your position as a councillor, I don't know exactly what your role will be in relation to these developments, but I mean, all I can say is just start with safety, and then everything else comes after that. I think it's not perfect. The recommendations which have come out aren't quite as comprehensive as we'd have wanted, but a lot of them are good. The next step is to actually get them put into effect, and as other people have mentioned, get them funded, because the whole problem of being local government is that you want to do a lot of things, and you simply can't for lack of funds. And we all know the effect that the cut in the central government grant has had on local authorities. But I think there's a lot of good stuff there. The next step is actually to get it implemented and to keep the pressure on.
Yeah, thanks so much, Graham. We've gone over time. I've delayed your family's tea, but this is such critical stuff. I thought it was worth it. So thanks to everyone for attending today, but particularly Graham, thanks for giving us such a systematic explanation.
Well, thank you all for coming in for and for the discussion.
Yeah, and could you send on that link, please, Graham? Thank you, and now I'll make contact.
Sure. Yeah. If Andy gives me your details, I'll message you or email you or one of those.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Great.
So Craig, before you go, have you got my email address?
If you could give it to me, I'll just jot it down. Yeah.
Yeah, it's Andy N for Neil Bates, Andy M Bates,
Andy
Uh,
M Bates
gmail.com. Yeah, N Bates, N for Neil at gmail.com.
at gmail.com. Okay, I'll do that just now.
Yeah,
Okay.
and then I'll just connect you with Graham. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Thank you very much for that.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. You're free to go and have your tea or make your tea or whatever you do on a Monday night.
Okay.
Right.
Right.
Thanks
Bye.
again.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheerio.
Cheers, Andy.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.